So good evening. I'm Emma Hoddinott. I'm one of the Assistant General Secretaries here at the Co-op Party. And hopefully you are joining us this evening to find out a bit more about the Co-op Party Rural Commission and the review that we've just released in the last week. So hot off the press. And really pleased I've got some great speakers to talk about that for you. And I'll introduce them in a minute, but a few things of housekeeping. So this call is being recorded. If you don't want to appear on camera, turn your camera off, basically. This will be recorded and it will go onto YouTube later for those people who can't join us this evening. They'll be able to catch up with us. The second thing, there is auto captioning available if you need that. That is available as well. And we are basically going to hear from some of the speakers, but hopefully we're going to have a chance for a few sort of questions afterwards. One of the easiest ways to kind of share your thoughts and your questions is the chat, if that's all right. So if you want to put them in there, that will help us. But we'll have an opportunity to maybe sort of pick up some of those themes, some of those questions at the end as well. So let me introduce your wonderful speakers for this evening. So first off, we're going to hear from Lord Steve Bassam. He was chair of the Co-op Party Rural Commission and is a Labour and Co-op peer. And he's going to talk us through the commission and what happened. We've got Baroness Sue Hayman here as well, who was also a commissioner and gave a lot of her expertise and did a lot of work to get our final report done. And it is available. I will wave it around. It's available on our website and I'll put the link in the chat for people as well. But yeah, an awful lot of work went into the Rural Commission reports that we're going to hear from. And just a special mention as well, we have Joe Joseph in the call listening to us this evening, who is also one of the commissioners. So thank you, Joe, for all your work as well. And then last but not least, we're going to hear from Chris Coucher, who's Head of Policy and Communications at the Plunkett Foundation. And very interestedly, we're going to hear about the work that he does, but actually some of the recommendations relate to the work that he does. So really interested to hear his thoughts on that as well. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Steve.
Hi, well, thank you very much indeed, Emma, for that very generous introduction. I'm not going to get in the way of a discussion and debate. I'm going to sort of get pretty soon over to Sue, who did a lot of the drafting of the report and was one of the commissioners. But just to say a few words of context, the commission was set up over a year ago, and there were a small group of us tasked with producing ideas that related to our cooperative values and principles that could help inform the co-op and also the wider labour movement policy process and look afresh at some of the issues which can confront people living in the countryside. It's worth saying that 19 million people, 17% of the UK's population, live in a small town or a village or a hamlet. Their lives are impacted by their ability to access services and to make good and best use of the beautiful countryside that we all enjoy in different ways. Over the last 20 years and perhaps longer, there's been a sense, I think, amongst people who do live in the countryside that, or in the country, that their life opportunities have been in decline. And so 20 years ago, you might have had one, you might have had two, you might have had several pubs in your village, you'd have had a post office, a local school, there'd have been a local police officer and a police presence. You'd have had access, maybe in some of the bigger communities, to banking services directly, and you'd have had a range of shops and some retail. Now, many of those things have shrunk, so the public and private provision in our towns and villages has begun to diminish. Bus services are a more recent and an obvious example. They've been in decline for the last 10, 15 years, but particularly in the last 10. And of course, back in the 60s, many rural communities lost their train service and access to urban centres of population through rail network. So with that sort of background, we've come up with a package of ideas and policy recommendations that begin to address some of those issues, recognizing that we live in a changed world. I think probably all of us during the lockdown in particular became much more dependent on the digital world that we're now in, and that does provide us with opportunities. And that was one of the issues that commissioners explored as we approached the sort of policy task that we were looking at. So what sort of future should we expect for our countryside and country living? What sort of things do we want in our towns and villages? How can we better access services? What sort of communities do we want to develop and grow and expand with? What sort of things can we do that address the poverty divide that's there in many of our towns and villages? Those are the sorts of issues that we were wrestling with. We don't want to see the countryside become the preserve of the affluent middle class. That would be wrong and unfortunate and a missed economic and social opportunity. But in many parts of the country, that is the case. So it's about rebalancing, and it's about looking at some of those issues, and that's what we've attempted to do. Now, I'm going to ask Sue to sort of take us through some of the sort of highlights, particularly focusing on issues like devolution and service delivery, which featured large in our thoughts. And Sue is particularly expert because of her DEFRA brief in agriculture and has got a long history of interest in rural affairs. And then we will turn to Chris to give us some views as well and open it up for question and debate. So Sue.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve. For those of you who have read the report, hopefully you'll have an idea of the kind of recommendations that we're looking at. If you haven't, just to warn you, there are 42 in total. So we did cover a lot of ground. But then if you're going to look at rural policy as a whole, it's going to cover a lot of ground because it covers a lot of areas. So just looking at the top recommendations, an area we looked at in some detail was what we call putting communities in control. Too many rural communities feel that they're kind of being done to all the time. So it was how do we turn that around? How do we make people who live in villages and small towns and hamlets like I do actually feel that they have much more control over decisions made around what happens to their local community in their area? And one of the things that we particularly looked at, which is why it's recommendation 1, was to ask any incoming Labour government to immediately review rural policy and establish a standing commission to monitor departments, what we call rural proofing policies across government. The main reason for this was that we don't feel that rural proofing has worked at all. And if you have a sort of a standing commission that's independent of the departments who can actually try and hold that to account, that should hopefully make a difference. And the other recommendation here was about including a community power act for any further devolution, to build on the Localism Act, but actually also to build on what the Labour Party's policy announcement on taking back control is about. It's about how do you devolve more power back to local communities, which then brings us on to the next area we covered, which was the potential for local authorities and parish and town councils to actually deliver change. I'm doing the levelling up bill at the moment. There's a section on devolution. It doesn't even consider parish or town councils. And I think we are very concerned that that gets overlooked too often. So it's certainly one area that we want to be, think that should be considered much, much more. The next section of the report and the recommendations were on how we strengthen the rural economy, because if we can't strengthen the economy, it's very difficult to actually bring real benefit back to the rural communities in all sorts of areas, whether it's from jobs, education, housing. It's all tied to the local economy. And we also feel that it was important that cooperative principles are built into how we do that. So one recommendation was for a national cooperative development agency. So you have that, and that's done regionally, so that it takes account of the different needs for each region, but also that it looks at how you work and develop cooperative businesses as well. So that was another recommendation. And then on top of that was to have funds to actually help then grow local cooperatives, because one of the things we want to see is a good increase in the number of cooperatives in that area. Community wealth building was then another recommendation to see how we can increase community wealth building. And then supporting business and jobs. One of the recommendations was around supporting SMEs. We know SMEs dominate the rural economy far more than they do in other areas, and also how you support self-employment and micro businesses. Another area looked at was procurement and public sector commissioning, and how local authorities and public bodies can have to test the market locally for cooperatives to be on tender lists, another way of growing the cooperative sector. Education and skills were looked at. We were concerned about skills and labour shortages in the education sector. And again, it's very important that you have flexibility in things like the apprenticeship levy, and how you have a proper careers service recognising the special needs of the rural economy, for example. Another important part was revitalising high streets. Again, you know, it suffered so much from COVID and was struggling before. So again, and how can town councils take part in that? We have a small amount on coastal towns and the fishing industry, the particular impact that they faced. And I'd like to thank the Association of Inshore Fisheries on the work that they have done and supported us on in developing this report. Then we looked at the kind of support that tourism needs, for example, and how it needs to be more sustainable, but also how local communities also need to be protected when tourism starts to provide problems. So again, worker and social cooperatives could be part of that. We then went into the cooperative approach to agriculture, sustainability, food justice, county farms being encouraged and increased, and how the government's environmental land management schemes can be used in a way that promotes all of this. We considered climate change and nature, because of course reaching net zero is going to be a crucial part of how we approach the cooperative Green New Deal, and rural approaches are just as important as urban ones in this area. Of course, energy challenges and fuel poverty have different challenges in rural areas to urban, people being off-grid. How do we actually make that work for people in rural communities? How do we have a good programme of nature recovery? So again, we're looking at targeted incentives around that. An issue that we were particularly concerned around is access to services. We know that too often rural communities don't have such good access to local services, for example, transport and bus services. So there are a number of recommendations about restoring lost routes, particularly around buses, but also around things like rail services. We looked at how we need a network of EV charging points, for example. Digital and mobile connectivity inevitably came up, and again, how we can use cooperative partnership models and community broadband initiatives to improve that. We considered the need of police services, wildlife crime, and how youth and education services should work better together to tackle things like county lines. Health and social care, mental health and isolation. Again, these are all big challenges, and cooperative models is something that can be developed alongside supporting the National Health Service and social care services. We've did some work on community assets and community ownership. The Commission supported the strengthening of the Localism Act to preserve local community assets. And we looked at ways that the community right to buy could provide more opportunities, for example. Housing and planning, obviously another big issue, social and affordable housing, the issue of Airbnbs, second homes, the hollowing out of villages, and looking at the importance of community-led housing, which matches local needs. And I think that kind of is a bit of a rattle through. So I hope that's all made sense, and I look forward to any questions on it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And you're right, there's a lot of recommendations, like 42 all in all, but I think they cover the wide range of topics. And I know there was a feeling from commissioners that they don't want to leave anything out, actually, that to look at rural communities in the whole was really, really important. I'd like to ask Chris to come in now, and Chris has got a few slides for us, I think, but feel free to explain to us. Not everybody will know about the great work that the Plunkett Foundation does, but also your thoughts on the recommendations as well.
Thanks ever so much, Emma. So yeah, I've put a few slides up because I realise I'm perhaps not as inspiring as representatives of the House of Lords, but it's absolutely fantastic to be able to join with you this evening, because I think from Plunkett's point of view, and for those of you that don't know who we are as a charity, our history is in the co-op movement. Agricultural cooperation was very much at the heart of what Horace Plunkett, our founder, put in terms of setting up this charity in 1919. So we've been around for a long time, but as a rural charity that is working with community-owned businesses and cooperatives now, actually a lot of this report spoke to us very, very personally. And I think we would welcome the fact that there is a dialogue happening right now about what is important in the rural setting, and actually how can cooperation and collective community ownership be really quite empowering at a grassroots. So, seeing the role of parish and town councils, the contribution to the rural economy, community wealth building, I just a few of the kind of the bigger picture contributions that we feel that actually our charity can demonstrate how it's already working. So what I'm going to try and just show in these very few slides I'm going to kind of illustrate is that I think actually the recommendations that we have before us actually are rooted in experience and practice of what is happening now. And so as this report goes from being a set of recommendations to a point of actually influencing both the Labour Party and the co-op's manifesto development going forward, actually we've got lots of grassroots experience of where communities are doing action themselves already that can really now start to bring to life some of the recommendations that you can see in this fantastic report. So very briefly, unsurprisingly, the businesses that we work with have that democracy and that collective ownership baked into them, very much so, true to the kind of nature of the co-op movement that Plunkett was always a part of. We have adopted the broader phrase community business, just in terms of a kind of modernisation of our culture and in fitting with the kind of growth of community and social enterprise, but still very much of those principles of democracy and collective ownership are central. The reality is this is a tried and tested model. So, Plunkett works with businesses big and small. Reputation will probably be most commonly associated with the community-owned shops and community-owned pubs that we've worked with across the country, but we work with farms, fisheries, woodlands, distilleries, bookshops, heritage assets, and everything in between. And while 736 seems like a relatively small number at this moment, it's kind of growing by about 30 year on year. And I think actually it's at the bottom there is the point that is probably most powerful. The 96% long-term success rate speaks to a testament that this model is working and is a viable and sustainable way of running services and businesses for local good. If you put that in comparison to small and medium enterprises over the same 5-year period, the success rate for an SME is around about 44%. So you're kind of doubling your money if you are looking at kind of community ownership and using those cooperative principles. It's a growing sector, as I said. On average, it's around about 30 new community-owned businesses are opening year on year. These are the specific figures from our recently published impact report that just showed us last year, in spite of the kind of lingering impacts of a pandemic, a growing cost of living and energy price crisis, still 23 businesses reached opening status. This is where residents are coming together and are saying, actually, there is a different way of us running our pub. And this is something that we want to look at together. So the community shares point there and the number of members that these businesses are attracting, I think, is a testament to the fact that this isn't just one or two people acting in isolation. You've got a movement here, and the movement's growing year on year. and really shows that the countryside can be a place that is accessible to everybody, works for everybody, and can be a thriving place to live. The impacts of these businesses, I think, is where we can really speak to the recommendations in this report, because I think the reality is we know that the countryside is losing residents to the fact that there's a lack of jobs, a lack of affordable housing, and for some there's a barrier to even entering into the rural space and seeking work or looking to contribute something, and not just see the green and pleasant land as a place for tourism. And I think actually community-owned businesses, because they are rooted in a place, they're owned by residents, run by residents, for the benefit of the community, you know, you're promoting how we can break down some of those inequities that exist in the countryside and create safe spaces for everybody. Obviously, the services they provide is probably the kind of heart of the reason they exist. The community-owned shop movement really took off in response to the post office network change program of 2008, which saw 2,500 post offices close across the country. And people started to say, actually, we could do business differently. And it's no surprise that around about 50% of community-owned businesses today still host some form of post office, because they kind of gone hand in hand. As one's contracted in terms of post office numbers, community-owned businesses have stepped in. The local economy point, you know, speaks directly to the report's aspiration to having a strong and thriving rural economy. Although these are small enterprises, they are often utilising the local supply chain, both from tradespeople to help actually refurbish and renovate and make good the spaces from which these businesses operate, but then actually through selling and supplying goods that are grown in the local area. And actually, I think community shops on average have around about 42 local suppliers on their shelves at any one time. And it's a growth model. If you're growing the business numbers, you're going to continue that kind of supply chain and looking at the localization. The employment that these businesses are creating often suits those that are struggling to find work through mainstream means, whether that is young parents looking to return to work, retired individuals looking to do something with some of their time, or speaking to people with mental or physical illnesses. Community-owned businesses have proven themselves adept at being employers in those spaces. And I think in terms of net zero, you know, they are already demonstrably leading on an environmental and ecological action at a grassroots level, not just through reducing car travel, but through actually taking steps and measures themselves in their operation to be green and sustainable. So our role, we raise awareness. Meetings like this is fantastic, and hopefully if I can give you one thing to take away from tonight is to go and have a look at our website and learn a little bit more. We offer practical support. So, you know, talking of a co-op development agency, you know, we'll be very keen to be involved in those conversations to, you know, give the experience that we have as a charity, and obviously working with partners like the Co-op Party to advocate for that supportive policy environment is absolutely critical to make sure that rural communities realise that this is a possibility, and this is there are routes to market, and there are ways that people can learn from what's been before them. So as I say, that is our website, that's our social media and our contact details. But Plunkett Foundation very much so welcomes the publication of this report. And I think actually, given that the next election is going to be very much so hotly debated as to how important the rural space is, it's going to be really critical that we have got lots of solutions to be able to present. And it's absolutely fantastic to see that the cooperative movement is really leading the way and being the first to present a set of recommendations for what we can do in rural spaces. Thank you.
Great. Well, I've been looking at the chat. I don't think we've got any offers yet, but please just put your hands up if you want to ask a question for one of our contributors. Who wants to go first? Don't be afraid. There's a reactions thing on the bottom there. If someone wants to hit the button there and make a contribution.
There's a few coming in now.
Oh yes, here we go. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with Philip. Unmute Philip.
Oh, thank you, Steve. I'm just getting used to all this modern technology stuff. I know there's only 28 people on the call this evening, but I've joined because I'm interested.
Good.
Where I live in Barnsley, it's a former mining town in Barnsley, but towards Penistone and parts of Sheffield and towards Rotherham, I dare say, there is a lot of agricultural land and small farms, small hamlets and villages. I put it in the chat. My specific questions, Steve, is the current government abolished the Agricultural Wages Board. They abolished the agricultural tenancies agreements, and they've not been very friendly towards the agricultural sector. But I also put in the chat, if ever we form a government, a Labour and cooperative government that is, could we extend the role of parish councils and give them a wider remit? I think that's enough.
That's very good. Sue, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. It's one of the reasons that in the report we have, looked at how you can expand the remit of parish and town councils. They know their communities best. And during the Levelling Up Bill, we've put down a number of amendments to try and use the devolution section of that bill to provide more power to parish and town councils, but the government just simply isn't interested in it, unfortunately. I mean, I want to declare an interest. My husband is chair of our parish council, so I really understand the amount of work he does and the amount of interaction with the local community that parish councils have, and it's just frustrating that sometimes that they can't actually take have a role that genuinely is better recognised as being important within the whole democratic process. I think that's something that needs to be done. Regarding the Agricultural Wages Board, for example, certainly in the Labour Party's last manifesto, when I was Shadow Secretary of State, we had that we would actually bring that back, because it was so important and because obviously agricultural wages are not good. So I would hope that that is something that would be continued by the next Labour government.
Chris, any thoughts on this one?
Absolutely, critical that the role of parish and town councils is bolstered. We've got a long-standing record of working with the National Association of Local Councils and would encourage any community-owned business to link up with their local parish and town council. I mean, I think, speaking to Sue's point, we've got to make the respect for these institutions reinvigorated, yes, so that we are filling the vacancies that currently exist across the country. And I think, as Philip pointed out, the kind of meaningful powers that they have at a grassroots level is probably what's going to best achieve that, because if you can demonstrate that these councils actually have a real fundamental role in what is happening in their local area, people will feel rejuvenated in terms of the opportunity that presents itself with being a parish and town councillor.
Yep, I agree. I mean, I think we need to address the sort of issues of democratic deficit and bring services closer, and part of that will undoubtedly mean giving more powers to parish and town councils, and also making sure that we provide training for those councillors as well, and support. I'm going to go to Lucy Naylor next.
That's just answered my question there. I'm a parish councillor, and my parish council is a bit of I don't think we have the capacity to deal with the sort of issues. We're already having services devolved down to us from a unitary settlement, and we don't have the capacity, the skills, ability, training or support. And as you know, I'm a rare one because I'm actually Labour and cooperative on mine. There's no support from Labour as well. If you're at town or parish, there's very little education or support, guidance or training. And my parish does struggle and would struggle, and I would dread it if any poor community shop approached my parish. They wouldn't do very well.
Okay, so
no, you make an incredibly important point. I think which is why we included kind of training and support in our recommendations, because if there is more proper powers devolved down to parish and town councils, they are inevitably going to need that training and support, but also because they haven't had any powers for so many years now. There is this kind of deficit as well as to what is expected from parish councils and town councils, and also the kind of people that want to get involved with them. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with people who currently are, but it would be if you had more power devolved and you had better training and you had better support, you might get a few younger people wanting to take part, for example, you know, to add a bit more, shall I say, oomph into some of the meetings. I mean, I can say this because my husband's a parish councillor, but I mean, I started out as a town councillor in my early 20s and then gave up once I had children. But it was a really good experience as a young person to be involved in my local community in that way, and it would be just really good if we can encourage more people to do it.
Chris, you've produced a guide, haven't you, with the National Association of Local Councils?
Yeah, I've just put that in the chat for everybody who's interested. So essentially, it tries to be a kind of step-by-step conversational point, but I think one of the critical parts that has sort of faded away over years. So I should say that, you know, I've worked in community development for around about 17, 18 years now. And, you know, there used to be a kind of a real desire to do what they used to call parish plans or community-led plans, which were like local consultations leading to nice social framework action documents that, you know, it would cover. Every single one always had the prominent places for dog fouling in their parish, but in amongst all the other actions, there were some really useful nuggets of activity that kind of set a document that in many places actually led to new people stepping up to the parish council. With the growth of neighbourhood development plans and a much more kind of natural and built environment conversation, these sort of social framework documents have sort of been pushed in the background. And I think there is an opportunity, I think, to look at how we do community consultations as a way of legitimately having a conversation at a grassroots level about what is important to you. And I mean, community-owned businesses have to do this as part of the process of sort of establishing that sort of broad democratic membership I talked of in my presentation. But I think if we can start to cascade that out into other forms of rural life, you will start to see a more informed and perhaps, again, more connected set of people that we could call upon as the next generation of parish and town councillors or supporters that parish and town councillors can call upon.
Yeah, very, very good point. But support, I think, is critical here. Emma has put something in the chat that would be useful to people, I think, who are contemplating a role as a parish or town councillor. So do take a look at that. I think it's the story of somebody who got involved in local politics that way. I'm going to go to Emily now.
Hi, good evening. I'm Emily Brothers. I'm a town councillor with Sandown Town Council, which is a coastal community on the Isle of Wight.
Oh, right, yes.
And 2 points I'd make, following on from what Lucy's just been saying and others, is that the County Council Isle of Wight, like all local authorities, are under huge funding pressures. So they close things or push things down to the town council level. And so we are taking on more assets, but without the funding. And therefore we are continually pushing up, I mean, this year by 50% our precept. But often those assets are for the main benefit of tourists and rather than local people. So we have this kind of tension. So for example, we have a car park adjacent to the beach, which is mainly used by tourists. The income continues to go to the County Council Isle of Wight, but the toilets that are at that location were passed on to us. We have to run them, we have to refurbish them. So we're going to be looking at taking out a $250,000 loan to do that, which will cost local people 10 years. So that's a kind of increasing pressure on us. And although some of us have wanted to do neighbourhood plans, many councillors can't see the wood for the trees, and so we can't get traction on that, because not only dealing with those kind of issues, but for example, as a coastal community, like a lot of places, we are having to deal with a lot of derelict hotels or other sort of leisure amenities, and as well as the high street, a lot of buildings closing, shops, etc. But hotels in particular, where owners are basically land banking, and they're going to rack and ruin, we're having fires, etc. So the town is kind of being dragged down, and and at a town council, we just don't have the sort of planning authority, the tools to be able to tackle it. And of course, as far as the county council is concerned, they've got bigger fish to fry, or to focus on, like the pressures on adult social care and education, etc. So they're two kind of main pressures. I don't know if there are any observations from the Commission on those points. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Emily. I mean, Sue can talk about this, I think, better than me, really, but I think we did take the view that if parish and town councils are going to take on more responsibility, then the money has to follow, really. It has to be there. At the moment, they can't, as far as I understand it, access capital sums. But Sue, could you perhaps make an observation on some of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think our thoughts around this were about the importance of devolving. I think we are the most centralised government in Europe. I mean, it's certainly very, very, very centralised, and we felt it was really important that you have better devolution downwards, and that would include town and parish councils. But if you're going to do that, the resources and the funding has to follow that. And the resources doesn't just mean money, it means sufficient training, how do you encourage more people to want to work in those areas, and so on and so forth. If you can do it so that you devolve all the way down from whether it's unitary or county or district or whatever other level of governance you have locally, but that would include town and parish, then you can actually get this to work really properly. But you have to do that. You have to devolve the funding as well.
Yep.
And that's absolutely critical to it. I mean, our local government system in England is just such a model. There are so many different ways that it's set up in different parts of the country, and it really, I think, just needs a shake up, and it needs to ensure that that people have better say and control over what happens in their local areas. And to me, town and parish is a critical part of that. But I totally get your point about tourism. I live in Cumbria. It causes all sorts of issues as well for local parishes and town councils. And again, we did. That's why we also did a very small piece within the report on coastal communities, because we are aware there are specific challenges that face coastal communities as well. Chris,
anything to add on that one?
No, I'll let the conversation flow, Steve. I think Sue's answer was pretty comprehensive there.
I thought so too, actually, but there we are. So we've got a couple of points in the chat. One of them I sort of think we've partly dealt with, which is to do with parish precepts being added to the council tax. Well, that is exactly what happens. I think that parishes have got a bit more flexibility and freedom, and that is a good thing. But really, the capital sums just aren't there. The next question that's come in, which is a broader one, but I think probably very important actually, and gets to the heart of some of the issues that we were looking at. And the questioner says, how do you balance supporting the farming industry and tackle climate change? And asks the very pertinent question, do farming practices have to change? Now, Sue, you're a bit of an expert on this one, so I'm going to ask you to talk about this. It's something I know that you're very involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, there's a big change happening at the moment with the move away from the basic payment system for farmers to the environmental land management schemes. And I think one of the things that we were looking at in the report and our recommendations was, how do you make agriculture sustainable while actually then still having a future for farmers and farming in this country, and how at the same time do you balance that with food justice? It's a huge issue to tackle. One of the frustrations here is that the environmental land management schemes have been taking so long to roll out, that there's been insufficient detail and insufficient uptake then because of that. So it's really important that farmers have confidence in actually buying into the schemes, if you like, that are going to actually tackle the issues around net zero, around increasing biodiversity, and critically stopping pollution. There's obviously a lot of talk about pollution of rivers at the moment. The issue around the River Wye is a big one with the pollution from the chicken farms. So it's a huge issue. And I think one of the concerns that I have is if we don't make the grants to actually improve all of this attractive enough, because farmers are also businesses and have to make money, that many will turn to more intensive farming in order to be able to manage financially. So getting that balance right is very, very challenging, but it's one that I think that the Cooperative Party has some really good proposals for. We know that cooperatives in farming do really good work. Agrarian cooperatives for SMEs are really good. I really hope that the Labour Party will kind of grab this part of the report and actually run with it, because we are at a time of big change, which also means huge opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's right, and let's just hope that we can make that argument within the broader Labour Party and get radical policies in that sector signed up to. Chris, have you got any observations or thoughts on that one?
Well, I think it was a point that Sue made earlier on that it's about not doing to a community, it's doing with a community, and I think that speaks with farmers, that any kind of change that needs to happen needs to be done with farmers rather than told what to do. I think at the moment, examples of sort of post-Brexit monies such as UK SPF, for example, has got an inconsistent delivery approach at the moment, because it's being distributed via local authorities with the intention of it being kind of connected to the grassroots. But the reality is you have got farmers and rural businesses that are looking to access the funding that's available to them, but it's inconsistent depending on which council area you live in, and that shouldn't be the case. If this is money that's genuinely there to support at the grassroots, it should be a consistent approach across the piece that needs to be in place. And I think that speaks to the level of you really do need to work with the grassroots to make these changes. So all of Sue's points, working with the farming community would be absolutely fantastic.
Just one other point, and that's Steve, sorry, is the other thing actually we really need to focus on is the tenancy farming, because too often they get missed out, or it's more difficult for tenant farmers to apply for a lot of these grants. So to me, it's a really important part of how we manage cooperative tenancies as well, and ensure that we support them to take advantage of all the different opportunities that are out there.
Yeah, I haven't got any other questions coming just yet, but we've got Joe Joseph, who is one of the other rural commissioners on the call, and I wondered, Joe, if you've got an observation on this, because I know this is something that concerns you.
Yes, thank you. I think the whole issue of the tenancy component is really important, both in terms of county farms being progressively sold off, also in terms of the ROC review and the future of the tenanted sector. I think it's probably worth mentioning under ELMS that, in effect, under Basic Payment Scheme, the reduction in true funding from 3.2 billion down to about 2.5 billion over the period up to 2027 is being further eroded by the increasing costs for farm businesses. And there really are some quite significant issues in terms of how farms are going to make up that shortfall, or in reality, quite a few of the smaller farms yet again will go under and will be bought up by the bigger farms, and potentially by those engaging in land banking for other climate mitigation measures, tree planting and such like. So I think there's quite a bit of threat around at the moment, and a lot of farmers are quite frankly disengaging at the moment from the whole process of ELMS, because the sustainable farming incentive, the reversion to the kind of previous versions of countryside stewardship, it's getting very, very complex out there. On the plus side, I think it's worth saying that there's a really dynamic cooperative movement building amongst new starters. So community-supported agriculture schemes are burgeoning. Agroecological land cooperatives are growing rapidly. People clubbing together to buy land and farm it intensively, or agroecologically intensively on a small scale, particularly around horticulture. and also on multi-stakeholder cooperatives. So people coming together to produce, process, and then sell into their local communities. I think Chris is probably better placed than me to talk about some of the new projects. Those 59 land-based businesses that you mentioned, Chris, sound really exciting. So I think some really good stuff going on, but it's happening at micro scale.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, we pick up on that in the report because we want to encourage good practice, and that's why when you look at the report, you'll see there are bits, examples sort of scattered throughout it, which try to give a picture of what we could achieve if we could scale up. And another interesting one here, someone's put in a question: how would we deal with big landowners, including the royals as well? So we're coming up to the coronation. I think it's probably time for King Charles III to be a bit generous. But how do we see the future relationship of the Labour government with the Crown Estate, maybe with the Duchy? What do you think, Sue?
There's a big question to chuck at me here, Steve. But I mean, I think the important thing for me on this is about how land is managed, what it's used for. There was a good report done with the House of Lords recently on land use, making the most out of England's land, which if you've not read it, you should have a look at it. It's a really, really good report, and about how you move away from a landscape dominated by food production and face the challenges and opportunities of the environment where nature and biodiversity restoration, carbon sequestration, and so on and so forth are at the forefront. So to me, I mean, one thing that ELMS does, moving away from basic payment scheme, is you don't just get money for owning land. I think it's incredibly important that that's happened. So landowners don't get a benefit just because they've got lots of land. They have to actually actively do something to improve the environment and make any farming they do more sustainable, if they're to get the grant payments. So to me, that's an absolutely critical step. I mean, obviously, just in principle, it would be good if the land in England wasn't owned by so few people, but that's another big question for the Labour Party. But just looking at land use and agriculture, it's all about sustainable environmental practices, and for food production, again, sustainable food production and methodologies. And and again, just looking at how we can perhaps get cooperatives more involved in the projects that are on those lands with those big landowners as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as you said right at the outset, it's about management really at this stage, because that's how you can most immediately make an impact. But it would be good to see, and perhaps it's one of the things a Labour government should do, is think of ways in which it can more imaginatively encourage big landowners, particularly those like the Duchy, etc., to develop cooperative models. There might even be a willingness there as well.
Yeah, there might be. And I think the other thing on that, just to say, of course, is access. I think it's really important. Again, that's in the report. Yeah.
Chris, a thought or two on that one?
Well, I mean, obviously, again, I would always bring it back to kind of the community and the grassroots. But if I could speak to the community right to buy, that is a recommendation in the report for both Co-op Party and Labour. The only UK nation that currently has a right to buy is Scotland, and actually the right to buy is often utilised in relation to land purchase. And it hasn't actually really cascaded down to the grassroots yet, where you are trying to buy micro entities through private, transaction like pubs and shops. But the land ownership there is being brought up to basically look at environmental action, look at different usage. But I think Sue's point about access is absolutely critical. But I think there's a whole wider conversation about, it kind of plays to the strength of the report that land ownership and food growth and food production and farming is only possible if you've got a workforce that can actually afford to live, travel, be a part of, access the kind of countryside. So, it does play into the kind of housing, the transport, the other services that are available, as well as just simply land ownership. If I could say, Plunkett Foundation is a part of the Rural Coalition, which is 13 organisations that has for a long period of time subscribed to a common vision of a living and working countryside. The NFU is one of our bigger partners within that place. And we've always tried to make sure that the case is being made that if you are making an aspiration or a desire to see more proactive usage of farmland, you need to look at it in the context of the community in which that farmland exists, and making sure that local people are able to live, work, utilise the space and contribute to the businesses. Just quickly on Joe's reference to community land trust, community supported agriculture, it is a really exciting space. And I think actually the fact that it's still being rooted in the principles of democratic broad membership and all of those kind of things that you would see from the co-op movement shows that we're not only creating an education of where our food comes from, but we're creating a commitment to actually grow better and supply better in different areas. And that's a really exciting opportunity to really kind of amplify as these recommendations go into an influencing stage.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to finish on that subject with, actually. Now, I've got Jenny Backwell put a comment in the chat saying, I thought this was quite a good observation, actually. She says, I realise how little I knew about this. Would be good if us townies understood better. We love rural shops or enterprises, but don't get enough info. And I think that's true, actually. I mean, it is something that, there's a sort of mystery about the countryside for people who do live in towns and cities, particularly big ones. And it goes back to Chris's point about not doing to communities, but enabling them to develop their plans and opportunities and so on, which is a strong theme in our report. But there isn't enough information out there, and I guess part of the Co-op Party's role is to try and improve that. We're coming up to sort of 8:25 now. I'm happy to take one quick question if there's anybody with a sharp point they want to make. Any more? Okay, look, it's been an interesting conversation. I've certainly enjoyed it. We should do these things more often. Do read the report. If you're in a position to make use of it as a co-operator in a town or parish council, do have a look at some of the detail. It's there not just to sit on the shelf, it's there to be used and made good use of. We're quite happy to talk to other audiences as well, Sue and myself in particular, and I'm sure Chris would. So if you're part of an organisation that wants to talk through rural policy, we're more than happy to do so. We hope to have a Co-op Party fringe meeting at the Labour Party conference in the autumn, and I'm sure we'll get other opportunities to meet with you and discuss some of the thinking and ideas behind our document. So I hope you found that useful. Do give us some feedback if not, and at that I'm quite happy to sort of wish you all good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. Good night.
Thanks
Good
all.
night.
Bye, Chris.
Bye-bye.